The moment looks small at first, almost throwaway, the kind of smirk and swipe exchange that usually vanishes into the cable news noise cycle. Quick jab, a dismissive laugh, a line clearly meant to belittle rather than debate. But on live television, with cameras rolling and clips already being carved up for social media, timing is everything. J.D. Vance thought he was landing an easy mockery, one designed to signal dominance and score points with his base. What he did not account for was how quickly the balance could flip and how one unexpected response would turn the entire segment into something he could not walk back. The exchange begins in a setting that feels instantly familiar to anyone who has watched modern political television. The studio is designed less for depth than for friction, with lighting, camera angles, and pacing all engineered to encourage sharp moments rather than sustained arguments. There is an unspoken expectation that the conversation will follow a predictable arc. One side provokes, the other reacts, and the segment moves on before anything truly substantive can settle. J.D. Vance enters this environment with the ease of someone who believes he understands the rules of the room. His posture and tone suggest comfort, even anticipation, as if this is simply another stop on a well-worn media circuit. Nothing about the opening moments signals risk. To the casual viewer, it looks like the kind of exchange that will generate a few quotes and then dissolve into the broader news cycle. That sense of routine is precisely what lowers the guard. When a moment feels standard, people stop preparing for resistance. The cameras roll, the host sets the table, and the audience subconsciously settles into expectation mode, assuming they already know how this will play out. That assumption is what gives the moment its quiet tension, because it creates the conditions for surprise without announcing it in advance. Rather than grounding his response in policy or engaging the substance of the discussion, Vance makes a deliberate choice to bypass complexity. He reaches for humor, but not the kind meant to illuminate a point or disarm tension. This is a narrower, more calculated form of mockery, designed to signal confidence and diminish the person across from him in one efficient stroke. It is a familiar maneuver in televised political combat because it is fast and it often goes unchallenged. A joke lands, the opponent bristles or deflects, and the audience is nudged toward a conclusion without being asked to think too hard. Vance delivers the line with casual ease, as if expecting it to glide past scrutiny. The tone implies that the matter is settled by implication alone, that the audience should accept the framing and move on. In doing so, he treats the moment as transactional rather than risky. What he appears to underestimate is how much these shortcuts depend on shared assumptions. Mockery only works when the target accepts the role assigned to them or when the viewer is willing to fill in the blanks. By choosing speed over substance, he compresses the exchange into something brittle. It looks smooth on the surface, but it leaves very little room to maneuver if the other side refuses to absorb the blow. Before any words are exchanged in response, there is a pause that lasts just long enough to register. It is not dramatic, and it is easy to miss if you are not paying attention, but it carries weight. Crockett's expression shifts in a way that signals awareness rather than surprise. Her eyes narrow slightly, not in irritation, but in concentration, as if she is processing not just what was said, but why it was said. In televised debates, these microexpressions often reveal more than prepared remarks, because they happen before the filter fully engages. This is one of those moments. The room does not go silent, yet the energy changes. The rhythm that had been moving along comfortably hesitates, creating a brief pocket of tension. Viewers may not consciously identify it, but they feel it. Her posture adjusts almost imperceptibly. She sits more upright, shoulders squared, signaling readiness rather than retreat. This physical recalibration communicates that she is about to respond on her own terms. It is a nonverbal rejection of the frame that has just been imposed on her. In live television, where everything is compressed and accelerated, these cues matter because they prime the audience for what follows. They suggest that the exchange is no longer operating on autopilot. What makes the moment powerful is its restraint. There is no eye roll, no exaggerated reaction that could be dismissed as emotional. The control itself becomes the message. It tells the audience that she is not scrambling for a comeback but selecting one. For Vance, this is the first signal that the expected trajectory may be off. The joke has landed, but it has not ended the conversation. Instead of defusing the moment, it has concentrated it. That brief shift in expression marks the point where the segment quietly transitions from routine banter into something with consequences, even though neither participant acknowledges it aloud. When Crockett finally speaks, she does not do what the moment seems to demand. She does not push back directly against the remark, nor does she attempt to neutralize it with humor of her own. Instead, she sidesteps the frame entirely. By refusing to treat the mockery as a legitimate starting point, she alters the geometry of the exchange. Her opening words are calm and deliberate, almost conversational, but they immediately shift the focus away from herself and toward the tactic being used against her. This choice denies the remark its intended power, because it is no longer functioning as an insult. It becomes an example. Rather than defending her credibility, she questions the necessity of the approach. The implication is subtle but unmistakable. If the argument were strong enough, it would not require this kind of detour. She does not accuse or editorialize. She simply points out the structure of what just happened, allowing the audience to draw the conclusion on its own. This is a far more destabilizing move than confrontation, because it removes the emotional payoff that mockery relies on. There is nothing for Vance to spar with, no heightened tone to respond to. As she continues, the cadence of her delivery reinforces the shift. She speaks at a measured pace, with no sign of urgency or defensiveness. That steadiness reframes the exchange as analytical rather than adversarial. Viewers who expected a clapback instead receive a diagnosis. The segment moves from performance to examination without an obvious transition, which makes it harder to resist. Vance is left in an awkward position, because the original remark cannot be defended without doubling down on the very behavior she has just exposed. By declining to play the assigned role, Crockett forces the conversation onto terrain where intent and substance matter more than tone. In doing so, she quietly asserts control over the direction of the discussion, and the audience senses that the balance has shifted even if no one names it outright. With the frame already shifted, Crockett begins to introduce substance without announcing it as such. She does not say she is about to make a case or present evidence. Instead, she weaves context into her response as if it were the most natural continuation of the conversation. This is what makes it effective. The information does not arrive as a challenge, but as clarification. She references broader patterns, prior statements, and recurring behaviors, not to score a point, but to establish continuity. Each reference is brief, almost understated, yet together they form a coherent picture that expands beyond the initial exchange. The technique is subtle. By avoiding loaded language or explicit accusations, she lowers the viewer's defenses. The audience is not being told what to think. They are being invited to recognize something they may have already sensed. This is where the cumulative effect begins to take hold. One detail alone might be dismissed. Several, presented calmly and sequentially, are harder to ignore. The mockery that opened the segment now feels less like an isolated moment and more like part of a recognizable pattern. As Crockett continues, Vance attempts to interject, but the timing works against him. Interrupting now would only underscore the very dynamic she is describing. The more she speaks, the narrower his options become. He can let the context land, or he can disrupt and risk validating her point in real time. That tension is visible, and it adds to the weight of her words. The audience senses that something is being assembled piece by piece. This is not a dramatic reveal, but a slow tightening of focus. By the time the segment moves forward, the conversation is no longer anchored to a single comment. It has widened into an examination of approach and credibility, introduced quietly through the side door before anyone has the chance to shut it. As Crockett continues, the usual rhythm of the segment begins to slip out of the moderator's hands. The host attempts to reassert structure with a brief interjection, the kind meant to redistribute time and keep the exchange balanced. It does not quite land. The conversation has already developed its own momentum, and forcing it back into a rigid format would feel artificial. Crockett does not rush through her point, nor does she ignore the host outright. She acknowledges the presence of moderation while continuing her thought, a move that preserves politeness without surrendering control. This is where tempo becomes decisive. Live television rewards whoever sets the pace, and Crockett's steadiness contrasts sharply with the urgency creeping into the rest of the panel. She does not speak faster to hold the floor. She speaks with certainty, which makes interruption feel unnecessary and even counterproductive. The host hesitates, aware that cutting her off too abruptly could register as imbalance rather than management. That hesitation widens the opening. Vance, now no longer dictating the direction of the exchange, is forced into a reactive posture. He looks for an entry point, but the measured delivery leaves few gaps. Every pause feels intentional, not like an invitation to jump in. The moderator's role shifts subtly from conductor to observer, tracking the exchange rather than steering it. Viewers pick up on this instinctively. When the referee loses command of the clock, attention gravitates toward the player who appears most composed. The result is a quiet but meaningful transfer of authority. Crockett is not dominating through volume or aggression. She is dominating through coherence. The segment no longer feels like a series of turns. It feels like a developing argument with a single through line. Once tempo is lost in this way, it is difficult to reclaim without derailing the conversation entirely. By the time the host tries again to move things along, the moment has already stretched beyond its intended bounds, and the narrative direction has effectively been set. At this point, the exchange is no longer being defined by any single statement. It is being defined by contrast. On one side, Crockett remains composed, her delivery consistent and deliberate, as if she is walking the audience through a line of reasoning rather than sparring with an opponent. On the other, Vance's presence begins to feel unsettled. His earlier confidence gives way to shorter responses and visible recalibration. This shift is not announced, but it is unmistakable. Viewers are not just listening to what is being said. They are watching how it is being said, and the difference is doing much of the work. The contrast operates on multiple levels at once. There is a tonal difference, with Crockett maintaining an even cadence while Vance's interjections become more defensive. There is also a strategic difference. One approach is additive, building a narrative layer by layer. The other is reductive, attempting to compress the exchange back into a soundbite. As these approaches collide, the audience is presented with a choice, even if it is not framed as one. Which style feels more credible in this moment? Importantly, this contrast does not require agreement with Crockett's politics to register. It is about process rather than position. Viewers who might be ideologically aligned with Vance can still recognize the imbalance in control and clarity. That recognition is what gives the moment its reach beyond partisan lines. The exchange has become a live demonstration of two competing methods of engagement, and one is clearly outperforming the other under pressure. By now, the original mockery has almost faded into the background. It lingers only as the catalyst that exposed the disparity. What remains in focus is the difference in command. Crockett's steadiness reads as authority, while Vance's adjustments read as response. Once that perception sets in, it shapes how every subsequent word is interpreted. The message is no longer delivered explicitly. It is inferred through comparison, and inference is often more persuasive than assertion. Crockett eventually arrives at a sentence that changes the weight of the exchange without raising its volume. It is not framed as a rebuke or a punchline. It is stated plainly, almost matter-of-factly, which is why it lands with such force. Instead of challenging Vance's motives directly, she characterizes the move he made as a substitute for engagement. The implication is careful and restrained. When substance is avoided, something else is filling the space. She does not accuse him of bad faith. She suggests a pattern of evasion, and she does it without dramatics. That distinction matters because it shifts the burden of proof. An insult invites retaliation. A characterization invites refutation. To push back, Vance would need to demonstrate that his approach was necessary or productive, not just clever. In a live segment with limited time, that is a difficult pivot to make. The line lingers because it reframes the entire interaction retroactively. What had been a joke now reads as a choice, and choices imply responsibility. The studio reaction is subtle but telling. There is no audible gasp or interruption, yet the space after the line feels heavier. Crockett does not rush to fill it. She lets the statement sit, trusting the audience to absorb it. This restraint amplifies its impact. Viewers are accustomed to rapid exchanges and constant noise. Silence, even brief, draws attention. Vance responds with a smile that appears practiced, but the timing is off. Comes too quickly, as if to mask the need to recalibrate. The audience can sense the shift. The conversation has crossed from surface-level banter into an evaluation of approach and credibility. That single line accomplishes more than a sharper insult ever could, because it changes the lens through which everything else is now viewed. Once the lens changes, the original frame cannot be restored. Sensing the shift in momentum, Vance attempts to recover with what can only be described as a walkback. His tone becomes more measured, his words more explanatory, as if clarifying will undo the damage of the earlier jab. He frames it as a misunderstanding, a misstep in phrasing rather than a reflection of intent. This is a familiar maneuver in political media, designed to soften perception without conceding substance. The timing, however, is crucial and already misaligned. By the time he begins to clarify, the audience has already registered the pivot, and the impact of Crockett's measured response is still fresh in the mind. The walkback does several things at once. It signals awareness of the misstep, which implicitly confirms that the original remark was risky. It also attempts to regain control of the narrative, repositioning Vance as reasonable rather than reactionary. Yet the effort is undercut by the fact that the line has already been broadcast, clipped, and viewed by millions in real time. In political media, perception often moves faster than explanation, and live exchanges leave no room for delayed correction. The walkback arrives after the moment has passed, making it appear reactive rather than proactive. Furthermore, the act of retracting in itself draws attention to the original misjudgment. Audiences notice when a figure suddenly shifts tone, especially in the middle of a live debate. The smile, the recalibration, the careful phrasing all signal that the initial confidence may have been misplaced. Crockett, meanwhile, maintains her rhythm and composure, letting the narrative continue to unfold on her terms. The contrast between reactive recovery and steady command only reinforces the perception that the segment has changed direction. By attempting to soften the original jab, Vance inadvertently highlights its failure and cements the audience's impression that the balance has shifted irreversibly. Even as the live segment continues, the real battle is already being waged online. Clips are being clipped, screens are being captured, and Twitter, TikTok, and X platforms are dissecting every word and gesture in real time. The moment has been distilled into micro-content almost before the cameras stop rolling, and the narrative is now moving faster than the broadcast itself. Viewers outside the studio are not waiting for the entire segment to air. They are reacting instantly to what has already been framed as a turning point. Memes, captions, and viral edits transform the interaction into something larger than its original context, giving it a life that exists independently of the live debate. Social media amplifies the asymmetry that Crockett has already established. Whereas Vance attempted to mock, those same moments are now reframed as missteps and lessons in overconfidence. The mechanics of virality mean that clarity, composure, and contrast travel farther than nuance. Crockett's calm, measured response reads immediately as competence, while Vance's reaction is interpreted as flustered or overcompensating. Every pause she takes, every line she delivers, becomes a perfect clip for short-form content that emphasizes the reversal. Social media does not just spread the moment. It edits, highlights, and contextualizes it in a way that reinforces the audience's perception of who is in command. Even those who did not watch live feel the impact as the clips circulate. Importantly, the speed of online amplification leaves little room for Vance's attempted walkback. While he may later release statements or interviews to clarify, the initial impression is already encoded in the public consciousness. Once a moment is clipped and shared with context distilled into seconds, it becomes a reference point that frames all subsequent coverage. Social media acts as both a magnifier and an arbiter, rewarding the clarity of Crockett's response while penalizing the overconfidence and misjudgment that sparked it. The narrative, in this case, is no longer controlled by the studio. It has migrated to a platform where perception moves faster than correction. This moment resonates far beyond the personalities involved because it taps into a deeper, almost instinctive frustration viewers feel with political theater. Audiences are weary of scripted soundbites, contrived humor, and gestures designed to score points rather than communicate substance. When Vance delivered his mockery, it was immediately recognizable to many as a tactic too familiar to be effective, an attempt to dominate through belittlement rather than reasoning. Crockett's response, calm yet deliberate, bypassed the expected back and forth, and that refusal to play along strikes at something viewers intuitively understand. Authenticity versus performance. People notice when someone is being talked at instead of engaged with, and this exchange offered a live example of both approaches side by side. The nerve it hits is not strictly partisan. While ideological alignment can affect interpretation, the core dynamic mockery confronted with measured composure transcends political labels. Viewers recognize the imbalance between quick, surface-level attacks and thoughtful, strategic communication. That recognition triggers an emotional response because it validates an often unspoken expectation. Public figures should be accountable not only for what they say but for the way they conduct themselves in real time. Crockett's refusal to absorb or respond in kind makes the contrast more vivid, emphasizing that the moment is about more than a single jab. It's about approach, credibility, and the respect owed to both participants and the audience. Moreover, this resonance is amplified by repetition. Many viewers have seen similar scenarios unfold countless times, making them particularly attuned to deviations from the expected script. When someone finally breaks the predictable pattern without resorting to theatrics, it lands sharply. The combination of timing, clarity, and controlled delivery creates a subtle moral tension that draws attention, sparks discussion, and compels the audience to reassess not only the individuals involved but the mechanics of political performance itself. It is this layering of recognition and expectation that gives the moment its potency. By the time the segment reaches its midpoint, the power dynamic has shifted in a way that is unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The control that Vance assumed at the outset, his smirk, his casual delivery, his expectation that a well-timed jab would dominate the narrative has quietly eroded. Crockett's composure and strategic pacing have subtly yet decisively redirected the focus. She is no longer responding to his lines in a reactive or defensive manner. Instead, she is advancing the conversation on her own terms. The segment now reads less as a debate and more as a demonstration of contrast, with one participant dictating the flow while the other reacts. This shift is compounded by the audience's perception of authority. In televised exchanges, the person who appears in control of rhythm and emphasis often commands attention more effectively than the one who is technically winning the argument. Crockett's calm, methodical presentation signals confidence, preparation, and credibility, while Vance's attempts to interject or reframe feel increasingly urgent, defensive, and constrained. Every pause she takes, every phrase she structures carefully, reinforces the sense that she is steering the narrative, even as Vance struggles to regain a foothold. The visual and auditory cues reinforce this power transfer. Crockett leans forward slightly, maintaining eye contact and deliberate gestures, while Vance's posture subtly tightens, his expressions flickering between recalibration and hesitation. The host, too, becomes an observer rather than a mediator, leaving the exchange largely unmoderated as the tension unfolds organically. For viewers, the shift is legible in real time, and it carries weight precisely because it is not overtly dramatized. The segment evolves into a study of control, timing, and composure, where authority is asserted through steady presence rather than theatrics. By this point, it is clear that the balance has irrevocably tipped, and the audience can sense that the initial advantage Vance assumed has slipped away entirely. As the segment progresses, the physical cues begin to tell the story that words alone cannot. Crockett's posture remains upright, her shoulders squared but relaxed, conveying a sense of readiness and assurance. Her hands are controlled, occasionally emphasizing a point, but never flailing or overcompensating. Every subtle movement reinforces that she is fully present, confident, and unshaken by the attempt at mockery. Even the tilt of her head, the steady cadence of her gaze, and the calm modulation of her voice sends signals that communicate authority far more effectively than speech alone. In a medium as visual as live television, these details register subconsciously, creating an impression of competence that is hard to contest. By contrast, Vance's body language begins to shift as the pressure of the exchange mounts. His earlier relaxed demeanor starts to constrict. He leans back slightly, smiles falter, and his gestures become tighter, signaling discomfort and recalibration. His attempts to interject appear more reactive than assertive, highlighting that the narrative momentum has slipped out of his hands. Even if viewers are not consciously analyzing posture or facial microexpressions, they intuitively sense the imbalance. These nonverbal cues amplify what has already been established verbally. Crockett is steering the conversation, and Vance is being forced to respond on her terms. The host's attempts to moderate do little to alter the visual dynamic. Crockett's control is reinforced not just through her words, but by her presence in the space. Her calm command contrasts sharply with the subtle tension emanating from Vance. The combination of vocal precision, measured timing, and physical poise layers together to create a compelling display of authority. Viewers are drawn to the contrast, noticing it instinctively even without consciously identifying the signals. In this moment, body language becomes the silent arbiter of power, quietly validating the shift that has taken place while further undermining any attempt to reclaim dominance. The narrative is now as much visual as it is verbal, with control communicated through presence as decisively as through argument. Even as the cameras continue to roll, it becomes clear that a single clip from this segment will outlive the broadcast itself. In the age of instant media, moments are no longer measured by airtime but by shareability, clarity, and emotional impact. Crockett's composed response and Vance's visible recalibration create a perfect narrative arc within a matter of seconds. That arc is concise, dramatic, and easy to parse. Precisely the ingredients that make content go viral. Producers and social media users alike recognize this instinctively. The segment itself may continue for several minutes, but this specific interaction has already achieved the qualities that ensure longevity. Contrast, tension, and resolution compressed into an easily digestible moment. What makes the clip so powerful is its self-contained storytelling. Vance initiates with mockery, believing he has set the stage. Crockett responds strategically, refusing the frame, layering context, and calmly asserting control. The juxtaposition of overconfidence and measured command is visually and narratively striking. Even viewers who have not followed the larger conversation immediately understand the stakes and the outcome. This kind of clarity is rare in political media, which is often cluttered with interruptions, crosstalk, and partisan noise. The brevity and coherence of the exchange allow it to travel, be replayed, and referenced without requiring extensive background knowledge. The viral potential is further amplified by its adaptability. Clips can be captioned, excerpted, or remixed to emphasize different angles: the dominance shift, the failed mockery, or the strategic calm of Crockett. Each iteration reinforces the original narrative. By the time the full segment fades from the evening lineup, the clip has already migrated across platforms, shaping public perception independently. What was intended as a fleeting television exchange has become a self-sustaining media event. The original broadcast serves only as the launching point. The clip's life and influence will persist long after, defining the moment and, by extension, the narrative surrounding both participants. What Vance did not anticipate in that moment was the degree to which his own strategy would backfire under scrutiny. From the outset, his mockery was meant to signal superiority, to land as a clever aside that reinforced his persona while minimizing Crockett's presence. In his mind, it was a calculated maneuver, the kind of media-friendly jibe that has worked in other contexts and that would generate a few laughs or retweets among supporters. What he failed to foresee was that Crockett's composure would not simply neutralize the jab. It would transform it into evidence of a broader pattern, highlighting overconfidence, lack of preparation, and an avoidance of substantive engagement. The simplicity of his tactic, intended as an advantage, became a liability because it assumed complicity, that the other side and the audience would treat the mockery as expected rather than challenge it. He also underestimated how quickly the narrative could evolve in a live environment. One misstep in timing or tone can expand exponentially once the segment is captured and circulated. Crockett's strategic refusal to respond on the opponent's terms meant that Vance was forced into reactive territory almost immediately. Every attempt to clarify or recover became more conspicuous, emphasizing the disparity between his original intent and the reality unfolding on screen. He did not anticipate the power of subtlety, the calm, deliberate, and unflustered delivery that carried as much weight as words themselves. In trying to dominate with derision, he inadvertently invited a demonstration of discipline and authority that outshone the joke itself. Another overlooked factor was the role of audience perception in real time. Vance's strategy depended on a certain assumption, that viewers would value brevity, punchiness, and bravado over methodical reasoning. Crockett disrupted that expectation, showing that viewers are responsive not just to content but to conduct. Her refusal to be rushed, interrupted, or cornered demonstrated command over the moment in a way that is instantly readable, even to those who disagree with her politics. In effect, she reframed the engagement from a personal clash into a demonstration of approach and credibility, forcing Vance into a position where recovery was limited and high-visibility failure unavoidable. Finally, the rapid amplification of the moment by social media was something he could not fully calculate. While Vance may have considered television optics, he did not anticipate the velocity at which clips, captions, and reactions would crystallize the exchange into a simplified, viral narrative. The audience now controlled the interpretation as much as the participants, and Crockett's composed response became the defining moment. The misjudgment lay not only in the immediate exchange but in the underestimation of how one brief lapse could cascade into a permanent perception of miscalculated overconfidence. This was not just a failed jab, it was a public demonstration of how one tactical choice can rapidly invert a carefully constructed image. Once a moment like this unfolds live, it enters a realm that is largely impervious to later reframing, and that is exactly what makes the exchange so consequential. Vance may have imagined he could contextualize, clarify, or recast his mockery after the segment, but live television, and its instantaneous digital echo, operates under different rules. The footage itself becomes evidence, a fixed record of tone, timing, and reaction. Once it exists in that form, it is difficult, if not impossible, to undo the impressions it leaves. Every word, every pause, every micro-expression is captured and observed by millions, and these visual and auditory cues carry as much persuasive power as the content itself. In this sense, the live moment is not just a performance. It is a permanent imprint on public perception. Attempts to reframe afterward are further hampered by the velocity of social media. Clips are already circulating, segmented, captioned, and shared in ways that highlight the contrast between Vance's mockery and Crockett's composed response. Each repost, comment, and reaction acts as reinforcement, distilling the narrative into a simple, emotionally resonant story. An overconfident attack met with disciplined, calm authority. Viewers who encounter the clip later often lack the broader context of the full segment, meaning the initial visual and verbal impressions dominate interpretation. The framing has, in effect, been outsourced to the audience itself, who now controls how the moment is understood, long before Vance can issue statements or clarifications. The structure of live debate also ensures permanence. Unlike written statements or press releases, television captures sequential flow in real time. Attempts to clarify after the fact do not alter the original sequence or the reactions embedded within it. The laughter, hesitation, recalibration, and timing, all of these are fixed. Once that sequence has aired, any effort to reinterpret it must contend with the visible record of how it actually occurred. Even well-crafted rebuttals or interviews later cannot fully overwrite the psychological imprint left by the original visual and auditory cues. Finally, the stakes are compounded by human cognitive bias. Audiences naturally remember striking moments that confirm expectations or surprise them. Crockett's composed dismantling of the mockery becomes a mental anchor. For many viewers, the lesson is instantaneous and lasting. The person attempting mockery overplayed their hand, while the disciplined response commands credibility. By the time statements are released or explanations offered, the initial impact has already crystallized, and the narrative has taken root in collective memory. In live media, once a misstep is amplified and juxtaposed with control, it rarely, if ever, can be reframed to undo its effect. The exchange between Vance and Crockett does more than just dominate a single broadcast. It plugs directly into a broader narrative that has been developing across political media for years. It reinforces the tension between spectacle and substance, between performance-oriented attacks and carefully constructed argumentation. Viewers have become accustomed to televised exchanges where humor, mockery, and soundbites are used to create a sense of dominance rather than clarify ideas. In this case, Crockett's measured and strategic response becomes an exemplar of a different approach, one that privileges clarity, composure, and the deliberate unpacking of context. The segment functions as a live demonstration of two competing methods of engagement, and the contrast is immediately legible to audiences who have grown weary of repetitive media tactics. By exposing the weakness in Vance's attempted mockery, the moment reinforces the idea that derision, even when delivered confidently, is not inherently persuasive. Audiences see that overconfidence without substance can backfire, particularly when confronted by a prepared, disciplined interlocutor who refuses to accept the framing. Crockett's response, therefore, does more than neutralize an attack. It validates a method of communication that emphasizes evidence, poise, and command over theatrics. This plays into a wider narrative about accountability in public discourse, where respect for the audience's intelligence and attention is as important as the content itself. The segment also aligns with ongoing cultural and political discussions about how debates are conducted in high-stakes media environments. It demonstrates that public perception is shaped not only by what is said but by how it is said, and that control over tone, pacing, and presence can be as decisive as argumentation. Clips from the exchange will circulate far beyond the broadcast, reinforcing the narrative that the ability to maintain composure under pressure is a rare and valuable skill. For Vance, the broader narrative is less forgiving. His mockery, intended as a moment of dominance, becomes part of a pattern of overreach that audiences are quick to recognize. Crockett's response feeds into the larger conversation about substance versus spectacle, creating a durable story that frames the episode as more than an isolated misstep. The narrative longevity is cemented because the audience sees a clear lesson. Confidence alone cannot substitute for preparation and strategic control, and moments of televised hubris are often remembered more vividly than intended. This dynamic ensures that the segment will be referenced, analyzed, and replayed as part of the ongoing discussion about political communication, credibility, and the consequences of misjudged performance. When the lights dim and the cameras stop rolling, the aftermath of the exchange becomes far more tangible than anything that occurred on air. In those silent moments, what lingers is not just the miscalculation itself, but the awareness of its permanence. Vance may attempt to process the segment internally, weighing how his words and gestures were received, but the record of the moment exists independently. The studio environment, with its high-intensity lighting, multiple camera angles, and live audience energy, has captured every micro-expression, every pause, every shift in tone, and that footage cannot be retracted. The reality of live television is unforgiving. Once an impression is made, it is embedded both in the visual record and in the perception of anyone who witnessed it, whether live or online. This lingering regret is compounded by the understanding that the consequences extend far beyond the studio. Clips will circulate edited and captioned, emphasizing the contrast between his attempt at mockery and Crockett's measured, composed response. Social media and digital news platforms will distill the exchange into easily shareable, repeatable moments that reinforce the narrative of miscalculated overconfidence. Vance is left knowing that no post-show clarification can fully erase the impact of what was captured in real time. Every retake, every explanation, will exist in the shadow of the footage that audiences have already internalized. Additionally, the personal awareness of the misstep weighs heavily. In the quiet after the segment, there is no live audience to react, no host to mediate. The realization sets in that a single choice, delivered casually, has shaped public perception in a lasting way. The overconfidence that seemed harmless in the moment now reads as a strategic error. Vance may reflect on what he could have done differently. Pacing, phrasing, tone, or even deciding not to attempt mockery at all. The clarity of Crockett's response only sharpens the contrast, making the consequences of misjudgment unavoidable. Finally, the regret lingers because it is permanent in perception if not in intent. The narrative created by the segment is now part of the broader discourse on political conduct and credibility. Vance's misstep, captured and amplified, will be referenced and replayed in future discussions, creating a lasting impression that cannot be undone. The cameras may be off, but the moment has achieved a permanence that makes the impact of his overreach tangible, immediate, and enduring. The regret is not just personal, it is public, visual, and irreversible, leaving an indelible mark on the memory of both the participants and the audience alike.